Hi, it's Dr. Parikh. So Module 5, Violence and Trauma. It's a rough one. So we'll talk about domestic violence and online sexual harassment. Actually, I think the order there is flipped a little bit. We'll talk about sexual assault, Me Too, which we've mentioned a little bit before, and then we'll end talking about some targeted populations who are at higher risk for violence and murder. So the first one, Keener talks about online harassment, and this reminded me a lot of themes from the Zoe and the Trolls article that we read as part of Career and Womanhood. So I think online harassment, it can be used as part of relationships. It can also be used as part of, I think, just keeping women out of spaces. So really just harassing women out of men-only spaces, like what happened with Zoe. And I think one thing first I want to point out that there is almost always a gap between technology and scholarly publishing, because start to finish, even if you're really quick, a study takes 6 months to a year, from when you have the idea to when you have the data in hand to do the study. But most journals, so you have to write everything up, which takes a lot more time than it seems like it should. And then you have to submit it to journals, and that's a lengthy process. You can only do one journal at a time. Usually you start for the highest journal that you think you might fit in. That person might just reject you right off the bat. They might do a revise and resubmit and then reject you. So they ask you to make some changes. You make them, and then they say, not so much. Usually a revise and resubmit is good. But even if you get rejected, it can take, sometimes there's a quick reject, like this is definitely not appropriate, and that might be a few weeks. But it's more likely to be 2 to 6 months or longer to waiting just to hear that you got rejected. Then you would apply to, you'd submit to the next highest journal. Even if things go well, it just takes time for the reviewers to give all their comments, for you to respond. Usually you get a revise and resubmit, so they say we want to see what you revise and then do it again. So I'm going into a bit more detail than I probably need to here, but I want you to understand when I say that just getting accepted into a journal can take a year or two, and then it may take another 6 months to a year before your data becomes available. Advanced online publication is helping with that. So once a journal has decided to accept an article, they might throw it up online, even if they don't know yet when it's going to come out in the printed journal itself and get its final volume and page number. But it's still a real issue. So it may take 2 to 3 years or longer from when you have the idea to do the study to when it actually gets out in a journal. That is a very long time in terms of social media norms. And on top of that, most researchers are probably not the most in touch with what the kids are doing these days. And particularly, even by the time people are getting to college, they may be using different social media than people in middle school and junior high and high school. So I think it's really tough. I'm very skeptical when I read things about online, especially social media, just because the landscape changes so quickly. So by the time something's published, I worry that it's out of date. And particularly by the time something makes it into a textbook, it is very old. Because it takes, another textbooks, even the ones that update every few years, if you just missed publications, it's another, now you might be 6 years out from when the person first had the idea, which is definitely a long time in the world of social media. Another really important piece to consider is how men's leaked photos are viewed differently than women's. And I think they give Anthony Weiner as an example. And I think it has a lot to do with the power of the person and the purpose for leaking. So are you leaking it to shame the person? And really, what are you shaming them for? Are you shaming them for inappropriate behavior or just for being sexual? Or are you, revealing their private body just because you can? There is a tendency to see victim blaming with consensual explicit photos. So sort of like, well, you should never have taken that photo if you knew it could be used against you someday. But I think with just with the ubiquity of cameras and photographic ability. It just, to me, it feels inappropriate to victim blame in this situation. And also, we kind of go back to, I talked about this a little bit with sexual assault in last week's oh my goodness, lecture, that, you can wear what you want, drink what you want, go where you want, and you should still have an expectation that you are not going to be assaulted. And I think, on the one hand, it is very good advice to keep in mind what might happen with any photos or videos you take. And it probably is safer to not take any. There's a lot of things that are safer that we don't do. So I think it's unrealistic to say if the photos were consensual, then you're not really a victim, which is often the message. In general, it's really difficult to prosecute these. I think Zoe and the Trolls, that article talked a lot about how difficult it was for her to get content taken down. And particularly when Keener kind of walks through the reasons why, it makes sense to me. Also, laws tend to try to be specific, and then, especially as technology changes, those are now outdated and pretty much useless. Yeah. The next few videos are all focused on domestic violence experiences. I typically prefer intimate partner violence because it feels a little more broad to me, and I usually like the most inclusive terms possible. But this kind of talks about the myth of this typical intimate partner violence victim. I think a lot of people can become victims to intimate partner violence. I think some people do have a greater vulnerability, but I don't think anyone is completely secure. And I've heard from women to say, I never thought that I would be in a violent relationship, but it doesn't start out violent. And I think she talks through how that process happens and how it can happen very slowly, so that the person doesn't realize. And I think it is possible that violence and love coexist, that the person may actually care about the victim and also not have healthy ways of caring. And so you can have very violent experiences, but also very genuine, loving experiences, and that's very confusing. So she talks through the steps, these kind of subtle transitions, starting with seducing and charming, and then slowly isolating. So it may be moving, it may be saying, I just want to spend so much time with you. It might be critiquing friends and family members, especially as friends and family members start to express concerns about the relationship. It's very easy to kind of kick them out. And then you start by introducing the threat of violence, and then it slowly starts to escalate. But again, it's not just all violence all the time. It's a step over the line and then stepping back, and often big grand gestures to apologize, at least at first. And as she says, if you take it out to its logical conclusion, eventually it is killing the person. She talks about about the many aspects of a person's life that an abuser gains control over. And she talks in particular about the grave danger of leaving. And typically people really need support and help in order to leave. Because of all the things, often they may not have access to finances on their own. They might be able to set aside some money. They might not. Often part of abusive relationships is getting, all money together and perhaps keeping a pretty close eye on that money as part of controlling the person's movements. Part of the real scary situation with abuse is that the isolation, it's intentional. It makes it more difficult for the person to leave. And particularly, it often takes several attempts for someone to successfully leave. So if you have a friend or a family member who has said, I want to leave a few times before, you take time off work, or you sacrifice some of your savings, or you do something big to help them leave, and then they end up going back with this partner, it can be really hard to keep giving to that person and keep being there. But when everyone is gone, it's, there are some services and some shelters and things available, but it gets very difficult. And especially with cell phones, there's a lot more ability to, there's a lot more ways to research things privately. There's also a lot more ability to track things. And so it may be things like being careful to, write things down instead of texting it to a person who's thinking about leaving. There's a lot of things to consider, and domestic violence situations, leaving is very dangerous. The next section talks about specifically online abuse of women. So again, kind of touching back to the reading from the book and thinking about Zoe and the Trolls. This one is very, very, I'm trying to think of a word for it. Vulgar, explicit, but most of those things are read directly from online comments. And she talks about online abuse as trauma and how that affects people. And she goes through so many important things so quickly. Sexism in tech and video games in particular. Police protection. There is not enough police protection from intimate partner violence, but also from online threats. And there are, lots of threats that are made of, I'm going to come and kill you, I'm going to come and rape you. The legislation needing to keep up with tech, we've talked about that. Support for victims of gender violence, including just starting with believing them. So many women aren't believed. So many people aren't believed. And then also replacing hate speech with love speech. So the idea of creating space for vulnerable groups, and also being allies, but also I think it's important for groups to have space that is just for them, and also space that includes allies. Power and control wheel. So this is a common thing that's discussed around domestic violence. So I just wanted to get a basic video that talked about what it was. I want to point out some of the gender dynamics in this video. There is a man presenting on the topic and defines victims as women. So I slip into that a lot here. It's difficult to avoid it because it's so much the way we think about violence and relationships, but also the course is about women, and I am intentionally trying to keep the focus on women. So I give myself a little bit more of an out there, but it does ignore the existence of male intimate partner violence victims. And I think when a man is a victim of violence, for one, it really goes against what it means to be a man, because to be a man is to be powerful and to be able to protect yourself and to be big and strong. And so if you are a victim of violence in your relationship, you are going against that. So if your abuser is a woman, again, there's all that stigma and I think there's difficulty of being believed. How are you getting hurt by someone who is at least supposed to be smaller and weaker than you, and may actually be smaller and weaker than you? You may just not want to punch back. Because also if you're both in a fight, typically the man is going to be viewed as the aggressor, even if he was defending himself. But also if you just don't want to fight back, if you don't want to escalate the violence. And if you're a man and you are being abused by another man in a relationship, there's concerns of stigma around LGBTQIA issues. So whether the police will, they might believe you, but will they care? Will they see you as a victim, or is it, kind of like with sex workers? Well, if you're going to be in a gay relationship, then that's what you deserve. On the flip side, we also are assuming that men are the aggressors here, which is not always the case, because there can be male victims in male-female relationships. There also can be female victims and aggressors in female-female relationships. So I want to constantly draw your attention to underrepresented groups in this course. It's also tough because I certainly don't want to say that men cannot present on these issues, cannot be knowledgeable on these issues, but I want to notice who is being given the microphone. He talks about some of the tactics that affect relationship norms and can kind of increase the power and control. So touching on some of the things we have heard about before. And what I like is the acknowledgement that if you ask the abuser what they want, they're not going to say, I want to control every piece of this person's life. But it's just that person has very rigid goals, and they feel entitled to have their desires met and will do what it takes to make that happen. So I like that kind of humanizing piece, because I don't think there are many people in the world who are just absolute monsters. And even then, I think none of us are monsters in our own mind. And I think it's helpful to understand what the other person is going for. It also helps because if you imagine the abuser as a monster, it's really tough to understand why a domestic violence victim might go back or might stay. And so the more we can contextualize and humanize the relationship, the more we can empathize not just with the aggressor, but with the victim. This video, I liked some of the ways that they talked about different ways of manipulation and control, so kind of an illustration of the power and control wheel. And I also like that it was intentional outreach from law enforcement to allow women to feel, or all people, but to kind of humanize and I think say, we believe you, we understand that this happens, we know how this happens, and we want to help you. And I think that can be really powerful. This next one is just kind of talks about rape culture in general. So rape culture is the idea that our culture normalizes rape in many ways. And I invite you to think about which of the statements surprised you the most. Were there any that you weren't familiar with, that you hadn't heard before, or maybe ones that you've heard before, but you haven't really thought of how it actually does support rape culture? And just trying to think in general, what are other pieces of our culture that do contribute to rape culture? To kind of supporting and treating rape as just a thing that happens. And I think there's a lot of myths around prevention, that if you do these things, you're safe from rape, but that, for one, isn't true. You can do everything right and still be raped. Also, it really opens the door to victim blaming, to say, well, it wasn't that hard to prevent rape and you didn't do it, so, maybe you kind of wanted it. Maybe you were asking for it. So what I encourage is to think about things like prevention versus risk mitigation. So thinking more about trying to reduce your risk, but acknowledging that, for one, if you don't do it one day, that doesn't mean that you deserve to get raped. And it also doesn't mean that you can never possibly be raped. So some of the things we hear a lot are drinks. So women are coached on how to protect our drinks. My spouse tells me that apparently there's also a lot of stuff going on about how sometimes men get targeted to get drugged, with the idea that if I take out the protectors or the competition, then I'm more likely to score. It's not great that they're getting drugged, but they're probably not also getting raped, so that's helpful. Again, men can get raped, so in that case, that statement was somewhat dismissive, but I think the intention, at least as my spouse presented it, was to drug someone just so that they would be incapacitated, so that you could then go probably rape someone else. It's a great week in this class. So women are coached on how, you get your drinks directly from the bartender, you watch your drinks. If you see, you keep an eye on your friends' drinks. And again, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I want to point out the level of vigilance that women are accepted to take on just to go about our daily lives. There are other things like, when you're parking your car, think about whether it's going to be dark when you come out and whether there will be people around, and make sure that you're not parking, next to a big scary van or against a wall where you might be trapped. There's just so much. We're just taught to constantly anticipate being raped. We're taught to carry our keys in our hand, both so that it's easy and fast to get into our car. Now, lots of us might have the keyless entry where we just need to have our key in our purse or our pocket, but still part of it was to get into your car as quickly as possible. So you always find your keys before you go outside, and you may walk with your keys through your fingers so that you can gouge somebody's eyes if you need to. And this is just a normal day of life being a woman, and my husband was in his mid-30s and had never heard of it. I've also heard things like not wearing skirts, particularly I worked in a women's prison And I heard some people who said, even though it was a women's prison, still just part of their training for working in prisons was that you never wear a skirt to prison because you never want to, you never want to make yourself an easy target for an assault. But I've heard just in general that like, oh, I've heard of things that are supposed interviews with people who have committed rapes and them saying how they choose their victims. And I'm really torn on informing people versus kind of creating this panic. So we're told to be careful about our footwear. Even when I worked in a prison, I know particularly segregation wasn't thrilled when we wore scarves to go, because mental health goes and visits people in segregation. And you weren't really supposed to wear a scarf because it makes you very chokeable. But I remember even once I was probably an early to mid-teen, and my grandma sent me one where they talked about a ponytail, that a ponytail makes it easier to hold your hair and rape you. And I still periodically think about that and feel guilty that I often wear my hair back. And just what it says that has stuck with me so deeply. And that I periodically think about how my hair affects my risk for being sexually assaulted. And that I just kind of often take that for granted as the way life is and the way it should be. And I also know that in some more conservative cultures where women have fewer rights, there can also be expectations that if you are alone in public and you're assaulted or even just kind of grabbed, so not raped, but more lightly assaulted, that's completely reasonable because that's what you get for going out in public without a protector. If you wanted to not be assaulted, you wouldn't have gone in public, or you would have only gone if you had a male relative who could go with you. And so for me, sometimes seeing the logical extremes of rape culture helps me understand, like, oh, but this isn't that different, that we as women send each other protective warnings about how to not get raped or abducted. And beyond that, we also have a lot of false beliefs about who is raping. We think of the stranger in the street, but it's often more an acquaintance, someone we know. We also think about, we think about this kind of violent stranger rape, and there's a lot less discussion of date rape or marital rape even. You can, legally until the 70s, you could not, in many places of the US, you could not file rape charges against someone you were married to. Regardless of the situation, by being married, you implicit, the belief was you consented to sex because you were married. This next one talks about reporting systems sexual assault survivors want. It's depressingly small how risky legal consequences are for sexual assaulters, for rapists. It's just ridiculously unlikely that if a person rapes someone that they're going to see any sort of legal consequences. Even to be brought to court is unlikely, but especially to be found guilty. What I found really interesting, the presenter here focused on serial rapists and on a reporting system that would trigger for serial rapists, but not for one-off rapists. And I think there's some really interesting ideas in this talk, but what really struck me was this sense that we are motivated to protect others, but not to ask for justice for ourselves. And I wonder how much that might be a distinctly womanly thing, that we are meant to be self-sacrificing and nurturing. I also wonder how much of it is the safety in numbers, that I don't think anyone will believe me if I'm the only one to say it, but if multiple women come forth, then we might be trusted. And we have a lot of examples, recently of individual women not being trusted, regardless of how well educated they are, regardless of how articulate they are, just not being trusted. I also, and I forget if she mentions this specifically or if this was me putting this on, but the idea of questioning ourselves. I've heard a lot of women talk about like not realizing that rape is rape. Sorry, I just need to check a message real quick. Sorry, my husband's out alone with our kids, so I just need, not that he's not capable of taking care of a kid, but his phone wasn't working. And I need to tell him that I did get his message. So there's a lot of history of women, especially if it's not that stranger rape, it's hard to know, if I initially was into it and then I said no and he kept going, like, is that rape? Yes, it's rape. But we often question our own experience. If I was a little drunk, maybe I didn't really say no clearly enough. If you're so drunk that you can't say no, you can't consent to sex. It's rape. And so I wonder if part of it is that we question our own experience so much unless someone else says that they experienced the same thing and that it was a rape. So I think this is just, it's good ideas, but I think it's also good insight into how we as women perceive rape. This next one talks about how porn changes the way teens think about sex. And I think, again, I'm kind of I have this, this personal interaction with things, but I'm also looking at this bigger picture. So at the beginning, the speaker really emphasizes how she is a neutral party here. She doesn't have particular interest in sex, in pornography. It's interesting to me that she sees it as very important to say that at the beginning. How does that make her, what does she think that's going to change about how her message will be received? So I just thought that was interesting. And I think there is sort of this complexity to talking about sex and pornography. And she talked about how it was used to really engage students in discussion. And I'm curious how much of it is, she kind of frames it as like, they always get talked to about this, and we, for one, are like, they're finally being asked to share their thoughts. But it also could just be that it's like an exciting topic, and it is, just feeling like you're being counterculture somehow by discussing this, especially by trying to discuss this with, in an academic setting. And there are a lot of difficulties to studying this issue, to really finding out how pornography leads to or increases the likelihood, is associated with sexual violence. I've talked before about the self-selection of people participating in research. There's also a lot of ethical considerations around asking about sexual behavior. And then there's a lot of questions of accurate self-reporting. So it's, do you have the insight? Do you know? Do you have a good memory for things? And also, are you willing to be honest, even to yourself, but especially to a researcher? One thing I really liked was the idea of modeling respect and consent. How do we have respectful conversations around issues of sexuality? So she described pornography literacy is presenting the truth about pornography to the best of our knowledge, given that there is an ever-changing evidence base. So I like there also that they are acknowledging the limits of what they can do, but they also kind of describe, it just feels like a very respectful setting, and it models the idea that you can talk about issues of sex, consent, lots of things in a mature, serious way. So there's a lot that I liked in that one. The next few videos talk about the Me Too movement, and it's easy to constantly shift the conversation away from the experience of survivors. It's common in social justice work. It's really easy, for example, if we're talking about racism, it's easy to get distracted talking about how white people feel when racism comes up. Same thing so when we talk about sexual harassment and we talk about women victims, it's really easy to get distracted by how the men feel in the situation. Part of it is it's very easy for it to happen. Part of it is that you always want to you don't want to think about how you're affecting people. So you're trying to protect yourself from knowing what's happening, but also it's just an uncomfortable conversation. and the people in power have the most power over the conversations. So which groups are most vulnerable? It's almost always going to be which ones have the least power. So in American society, that tends to be female, trans, indigenous, disabled, black, and low-wage workers. She talks about how trauma halts possibility and movement activates it. So how advocacy work, helping fields, this sense of getting momentum is really important for feeling like there's possibility again. She talks about power imbalances. She also talks about the issue about performing pain, that we often ask survivors to show us their pain and to perform for us. And then I think it's interesting to think about, is it possible to ever reach a future without sexual violence? My instinct is to say no, but maybe it is possible. Maybe we will eventually reach it. But we certainly want to keep moving toward it. Even if it's not a realistic end goal, it's the end goal we want to move toward. So this is the same person, just in a different, in an interview. And here she talks, what I heard more distinctly from this conversation was a conversation about how communities hide and enable predators. And so really thinking about how preventing sexual abuse and trauma is the responsibility for entire communities and societies. She talks some about social media and community organizing, and it can be tough to decide which goals you really want to go after when you're doing any sort of social justice work. Intersectionality, we've talked about this several times, but I want to bring it up again. This historical inability for particularly Black communities to stop sexual violence. It was a fact of life within slavery, and slavery is the definition of being powerless. And so there is no way to stop. I read somewhere recently where there was a written record where a slave woman's husband was traveling, had been, not like he decided to go travel. He was sent somewhere else for several months. And so the slave owner said that he had, because the husband was gone for so long, he had bred the woman with someone else. So literally just thinking of it as managing livestock who happen to also have cute little pairings. So when you have these centuries, I've also heard recently spoken that Black people were enslaved in the New World longer than they have been out of slavery. Because for us, it can feel like slavery was a very long time ago, but these ways of survival had become so entrenched culturally. This wasn't just, a decade of pain. These were centuries of pain and lack of power. And so we can start thinking about, when we think of power, also think about which voices have power and which victims have power. Me Too, we often think of sort of Hollywood executives and white women pointing fingers, and we certainly, all victims are valid. But there's a whole piece of Me Too that is, at least for me, I was not as aware of, that focuses on the voices of women of color and other underrepresented groups. This article or interview or whatever, it's an interesting question of how do we move forward after someone is identified as behaving inappropriately as part of Me Too. And I think it's this question of how, if we don't want throwaway lives, how do people show that they've rehabilitated? Who gets to decide that it's, that you've, done the work you need to do and can come back into the fold? What does redemption look like? And I think it's a tough question. Is it fair to expect to get to go back to using the talent set that you have? Because it's a set of skills and networking that the person has spent probably decades of their lives building, and that is very lucrative. But also, is it fair to expect just to get to go back to that? And I think a big question that at least a lot of the people I'm in circles with are talking about right now is, how do you value someone's talent when you don't agree with the person's views. Sort of how do you dismiss the person's work because they stand for difficult things? And I think that's a really difficult question. I don't think there's a clear answer. How long is long enough? Again, it's tough to say. And it's not just biding your time. It's also, are you actually changing attitudes? Are you working to understand? But how do you show that? These are very difficult things to show, especially, you might learn a script, but how do you show that it's authentic? And who gets to decide? There's also discussion of, is it dangerous to be a man these days? Which is, again, part of the idea that it's easy to flip the script and focus on the person who is traditionally in power, which is men in the U.S. And back in Module 3, I played a portion of someone's talk who kind of talked about why it's actually not very dangerous to be a man, particularly you might have uncomfortable interactions, but in the career-ending sort of way, it is not very dangerous. It's very, very difficult to get fired over very small things. One thing I personally struggle with is how much sympathy do I have for people who are, who were socialized into a different set of rules. So they grew up with the expectation that certain things were acceptable. Now those things are no longer acceptable. And somebody has to get caught in the middle. But it's still really tough for those people. And again, maybe I'm having a little too much sympathy for the victims here, or for the aggressors here. See my word slip there. I think it's a difficult situation. I really do. And another big question is social media shaming appropriate? And I think that's a really hard thing to answer. I think on social media, there's a bigger sense that people can make small slips and be shamed. I also don't know how powerful those shamings are. I don't know that they're career ending per se. But maybe they are. It's a difficult piece. So now we're moving into talking about some specific subpopulations that are at risk. So this is thinking about violence against transgender individuals, how it's kind of on the rise, and it looks like I was in the middle of that and stopped. All right, the next one's done at least. So part of it is just broadly I want to say, we have a lot of myths societally about who is dangerous and who is likely to be a victim of violence. So LGBT individuals, trans individuals. One of the big examples I give is the mentally ill. We're afraid of the crazy person, but people with serious and persistent mental illness like schizophrenia are much more likely to be the victim of violence than to be the aggressor of violence. And so for individuals on the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, there may be fear of them, like the bathroom bills are a great example of how there's a lot of fear about people being in the wrong spaces and taking advantage, when really trans individuals are at a very high, and LGBTQIA individuals in general are at a much higher risk of violence. I personally know someone who was just randomly attacked by a stranger for most likely looking gay in public. And then there's questions of who trusts the police, who experience violence or victim blaming from the police. If you don't think the police are going to protect you, you're not going to go to them. If you think the police may brutalize you further, you are not going to go to them. If you think the police are going to say, well, then you shouldn't be trans, what did you expect, going around in a dress, you're not going to go to them. Let me just double check to make sure that this is the one I'm thinking of. Yep. So this one talks about also the difficulty of reporting. So if you are, I really thought I did some of this work. I don't know if Google didn't save it once, but that's unusual. Anyway, if you, One of the issues they point out is that numbers for trans individuals for violence is only as good as the data that is reported. So if someone is not identified as trans, or if someone is not identified as murdered, they are not going to be on the list of trans individuals who have been murdered. So the police or medical examiner may misgender someone. The family may insist on misgendering that person. So if I'm a trans woman and my family doesn't support that and instead treats me as a man, and I am murdered, the police may go to my family and have them arrange things. So they may use my birth name, which is often called a dead name, and they may say, this is a male person. So there's a lot of concerns over who gets to control the narrative when you die and are trans. Because particularly if you're not legally married and the state doesn't recognize your marriage, then your next of kin may or may not be supportive of you and the way that you identify. But they talk a lot about what makes this population at high risk for violence and about the underreporting. So the numbers they report are staggering, and they're also probably too low. Another population that's known to be at risk for violence and murder is indigenous women in the US and I believe in Canada too. So one of the things I really like about this documentary I signed is just having images of modern day Native women, kind of looking, because I think we often have images that are stuck in the 1700s, 1800s for Native people, and we don't really have this, it's almost like they exist in history and not in the present for many of us. So it just shows current Native women, and I think it also shows a lot of empowerment. So taking power, speaking up for themselves and their community. Thinking about what makes the population vulnerable, and they talk a lot about it, and a lot of it goes back historically and currently, what sorts of things the U.S. government has done. And it reminded me a lot, I had really interesting experiences. I did my internship for a counseling or clinical psych PhD or PsyD, you do a year-long internship. I did mine in Minnesota at a women's correctional facility. And Minnesota has a large Native population. And I heard a lot of the women talk about this history of being stripped of their culture, of their grandparents being, possibly being sent to boarding schools because the government was trying to take away that cultural heritage, like very directly, like not hidden agenda, like agenda was to raise them to be more civilized, to be more white. So taking away language and practices and really stigmatizing anything associated with Native American lifestyles. There's a new-ish PBS show, Molly of Denali, and it's based on a podcast that I haven't listened to, but I've watched the show once or twice, and they have some they don't pull any punches on this. They have some really poignant episodes about this history of having culture stripped away. And the women talked about kind of trying to rediscover that past and reconnect with it. And I could also see a lot of the women talked about there just not being job options on reservations. There were Native associated casinos, and a lot of women perceive that to be the only job options, which is a real problem if you are recovering from drug addictions and the only place, or alcohol addiction, and the only place you think you can work and, support yourself and your kids is a casino. And here's just another perspective about Native American women and their safety. I really liked, she talked about art as activism and advocacy, and particularly such a feminine art. I think that so this is a very white counterpoint, but that's the culture I come from. I adore these sort of counterculture cross stitches or crochets, taking very feminine crafts and using them to express things that are not traditionally feminine. I think that's a lot of fun, and just, I like it. And I see this as very much the same, taking this very traditional feminine thing that had kind of fallen out of style for a while and using it not just to express yourself, but also as a form of activism and advocacy. So really recognizing that violence is affecting some communities more than other, thinking about the history of oppression. So she talks about it. So I already talked about boarding schools that forbid native dress, language, music, spirituality, food, and practices. And so when you do things like that, you are very explicitly breaking down community supports. So part of it is just education and representation. So I really talked about all of these things already, sorry. But Molly of Denali, that's, like I said, it's a show on PBS. I've heard that it's a really good podcast too, but I haven't done the podcast yet. And I also think it's an interesting example of an emotional appeal. How do you use human emotion to motivate people to take action, to take notice? And it's something you can keep in mind as you're thinking about the end of the semester, the last week. You start planning it next week, but doing an intervention and thinking about how to plan that, an advocacy project, and thinking about how art and demonstration can be part of that. So what did I leave out? As always, there is a lot of issues that affect LGBTQIA plus groups that I'm not addressing. I addressed some of them here, but it's still not a ton. Other underrepresented groups. One thing I didn't talk about was women as sex offenders and abusers. I acknowledged it in what I said periodically. The facility where I did my internship had a sex offender program. And one of the things that was discussed was, particularly for women, the identity as a sex offender was very difficult. Partly because women are seen as, we are supposed to be very motherly and caring and very cautiously sexual. We didn't talk much about the history of sexual harassment in the workplace. And I like reading a lot of old novels, partly because they're often cheaper free. But I'm reading a lot of, right now, things set in kind of the 20s and 30s, Agatha Christie novels. And there's often statements, I like her writing, but she is extremely racist, extremely classist. And there's a few books where she is very much like, a man who gets violent with you sometimes shows that he really loves you and has passion. So there are some serious issues. And one of the things she'll frequently say is, no nice girl would take a position like that. So a lot of, and part of the idea is that the opportunity for abuse is so high that if you wanted to protect yourself from abuse, you would not put yourself in that position. Also, the role of sexual harassment in politics. There's been particularly a lot of things in the last 3 to 5 years where issues of people with strong accusations of sexual harassment, of sexual assault, still moving into positions of power politically. And even thinking about, sort of historically, how has that changed? Kind of when did people start speaking up about it, and when will it start having more of an effect? We also didn't talk a lot about memory for traumatic events. So assaults and violence, it is a traumatic event. And it's important to keep in mind that when we have memories, details may change. My favorite story for this is talking about my obstetrician when I gave birth. He often wears scrubs, and so he wore scrubs when he came into the hospital the night that we went in, and we thought everything was fine, and then it turned out everything was very not fine, and I have this flashbulb memory of him standing there in his scrubs saying, "This baby is coming now." And I replayed that moment a lot, so I saw him several days after, and then I got discharged from the hospital. I saw him a week after I gave birth, and then I didn't see him again until, I think, 6 weeks later for my follow-up. And I replayed these moments in my head so many times, and I just vividly remembered him in his blue scrubs. And so I went into my appointment, and I was like taken aback, like almost physically jarred to see him wearing green scrubs. And I asked my husband later, like, what color scrubs was he wearing? Because I so clearly remember him wearing blue scrubs, and he always wore the same color, and suddenly he's wearing green scrubs. And I don't know, like, this core memory of my life is shaken. And my husband said, no, he always wore green scrubs. He was wearing green scrubs that night. And then my son was still in the NICU. He was in for over 7 weeks. All of the nurses in the NICU wore blue scrubs. And so I played this memory over and over and would have sworn on my life that every detail of this little flash of memory was correct. And actually I had changed by replaying it over and over while I was surrounded by people in blue scrubs. I had changed it. And so still genuinely, when I play that moment in my mind, I see him. Now actually the color of the scrubs kind of changes back and forth. That memory is corrupted. Every time we retell ourselves a story, we are changing teeny tiny details. It's not a little video that we get to play back. It's a puzzle that we're putting together, and we change the pieces as we go. And so there's a lot of critique of women's memories of traumatic moments. But when you look at how memories are formed and stored and retrieved, there actually is, even in these memories that feel so vivid, these things that you would swear you could remember forever or that seem like you should remember, there's a lot of ways that they can get changed. Similarly, there's a lot of issues with faulty eyewitness reports and racism. So people with darker skin are more likely to be pointed out as the person who committed a crime. So when we think about prosecution for rape, particularly stranger rape, it's important to acknowledge and keep in mind that there are people who are at higher risk for being wrongly accused than others. I talked a little bit about misconceptions about who's in danger, who poses a risk for rape and sexual abuse. Particularly sexual abuse, it's most often someone close to the family circle, someone the child sees a lot. But even for rape, again, we think of the stranger with a van or hiding in an alley. We don't often think about our friends, our dates, our spouses. I also want to point out that sexual protection of particularly white women and white girls has been used as a political propaganda piece. There's the movie Birth of a Nation, which was this, the first huge epic movie in the 1920s, and one of the big scenes, it was essentially about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1920s is when the KKK kind of had its rebirth, partly, I assume, because of this movie. And one of the critical scenes is where a black man rapes and I think kills a white woman, or she might kill herself later, I forget. And so it was really framing, this movie was used to kind of frame black men as risks to the safety of white women, particularly the sexual safety. World War II posters have a lot of propaganda and would portray Japanese and German, especially the Japanese soldiers, I think, as almost animal-like and dangerous. And there's one in particular where he's kind of holding this limp white woman. So a lot of propaganda that these people will invade. And unfortunately, often when there is a war, raping women is a big part of that. It's part of the kind of the power and terrorism. Also, there was a really cool article that I wanted to assign, but it wasn't quite close enough to our topic, about memes around trans bathroom bills. So when bathroom bills came up as a political issue, there were lots and lots of memes that got circulated, and some of them were against allowing trans individuals to use the bathroom that matches their expressed gender. And it was often, this person the idea was the person wasn't really trans and would be leering over. There were others that were against the bathroom bills and were, some of it was just saying, hey, this is a private space. I don't want someone, do you want someone inspecting your genitals to see if you belong there? But then there were also some where it would show a very societally accepted as sexy woman saying, do you want me in with your boyfriends and husbands, or a, you know, very masculine looking trans man saying, do you want me peeing next to your wife? So even these like pro inclusion bill memes, so these ones that are meant to show how, you know, meant to portray this gendering is ridiculous, we're still playing on the same ideas of this potential, you know, aggressor or this person who might lure someone away being in the wrong space. All right, thanks.